basically the English language natives are kind of fortunate because they can get away with not having to learn other languages. But on the other hand, they're unfortunate because it means there's no pressure to learn another language, which is just good for you intellectually and good for you from a general communication point of view. So pros and cons. I saw, I don't know if you know a guy called Peter Levels. He's software developer, but he's very famous in the tech world for being like a hacker, an indie hacker extraordinaire. So he's built multiple products. He makes about $3 million a month purely on his own sort of apps that he's built. So one guy. And he's done stuff like the AR avatar stuff. He runs Nomad List, the job board for. He's just very, very good at spotting a trend, building an app real quick, get out there, and then making tons of money. But anyway, he had a long interview with Lex Fridman, and one of the things he said was he's a Dutch guy, but he's left the Netherlands 10 years or so ago, and he says he now is struggling with his native language because English is what he uses every day, and he can't think anymore fluently in Dutch, and he rarely speaks it, so he's getting clunky in his own language. So 10 years is all it takes. So yeah, it's interesting. England, I mean, I don't want to battle it. English is dominant. That's fine, fair enough. But I think it's probably, pros and cons either way for all parties on that. Anyway, we should do a language Brainfood Live. I see no reason why we shouldn't do that. But before we kick off, let's welcome everybody to Brainfood Live on air, because we are bringing it to you, I would say, every Friday, no fail. But you might have noticed it's Thursday today. And there's a very specific reason why it's Thursday. It's because one of our key guests, Ray Walker, is going to France on holiday. So you and Adam can have a good chat about this. And he's going tomorrow. So I had to sneak this in early today, early in the week, to have this conversation now. So I wanted to get Ray's perspective. He is an expert on contingency workforce. And part of our topic today is, of course, 0-hour contracts, what the Labour Party is thinking about, Labour government now, what it's thinking about in terms of, workers' rights and so on. So I've made a list of the manifesto promises that Labour have made with regards to employment and recruitment. And we're going to go through them one by one. And we've got a wonderful guest list today with expertise from Neil Carberry, representing the Recruitment and Employer Confederation from the agency side. We have David D'Souza, who's the Director of Profession at CIPD, so he can give us the view from a HR point of view. We've got Ray as well, looking at on the non-FTE. So it's going to be fantastic. All right, folks, just do a quick sound check. I want to make sure you can hear us okay. If you can, let me know in the chat whether the audio and visual is fine. I've noticed actually the gain on this microphone has really been off for like last 6 months. So the audio has been really bad according to my own replaying of those events. So I want to make sure that the audio sounds good for you. It's not too echoey, not too loud. Let me know in the comments whether that's the case. We are live streaming this on LinkedIn Live, of course. So if you're watching this on LinkedIn, welcome. Do make sure you comment and contribute to the conversation. We're going to try and pick up those chats on LinkedIn as well. And of course, if you can hear us fine on LinkedIn, do let me know also on that. Just let us know in comments. Okay, cool. We have to thank our sponsors, of course, folks. Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Rob, and all this type of stuff. Great stuff. We have to thank our sponsors, obviously, for Brainfood Live, because without our sponsors, we cannot run this show. And today's sponsor is, of course, Worksome, Ray's employer, as a matter of fact. And Worksome, if you didn't know, are the business that provide you with a one-stop shop to deal with all of your HR, legal, payroll, all that type of stuff. So if you have any kind of component of your employment workforce is significantly non-full-time employee, or you plan for this to be the case, you probably need to have a solution similar to Worksome. So do check it out. I'll be trying to do a sort of a founder's focus with the CEO of Worksome, the Danish company, in the next couple of weeks. So make sure you tune into that as well. But I'm going to share the Worksome link down there and make sure you check them out. By the way, if you want to know more about Worksome and you want to know more about non-FTE generally, Worksome are doing an event at Lantana at London Bridge on the 3rd of October. And you simply register to attend that if you're interested in flexi work and all that type of stuff. So make sure you tune in to that. Okay, Adam, we have you back from your long sojourn, which is a French word, I believe, in France. I hope you had a good time, and you look ruddy faced. So I hope that's a tan from the water or something,
That's
rather
what
than
you always say, ruddy faced. That's just my tan. That's the way I
is
get a tan. I just go red.
you're looking like a roast beef. I'm not sure you'd appreciate that, but the Frenchies like to label the English, not the Scottish, so the le roast beef.
Not ideal, is it?
Not ideal. Anyway, how you been? Have you had the time to read the newsletter? If so, man, let me know what was interesting, man.
Yeah, I've been good. And yeah, I have had time to read the newsletter. So the first thing I'll say is if we've got anybody here from Italy, Greece, or Portugal, then they're probably doing it from the side of a swimming pool, I would think, or something like that at this point, because holiday habits in Europe. Countries in the sort of south of Europe tend to favor longer summer vacations, especially in August, where they've got things like school closures, there's more public holidays, workplaces actually close. And some of these norms mean that those countries tend to have uh, less holidays throughout the calendar year, but in those hot months over the summer, they tend to take longer breaks. Which I found one thing I found interesting about that is that Spain actually doesn't really do it like that. People in Spain tend to be more like Northern Europeans, where they're more likely to spread their holidays more evenly across the year,
Hmm.
which I thought was quite interesting. But I also, as I was reading it, I didn't see any indication that, like, I mean, the Scandinavian countries basically shut down like
Correct.
slightly earlier in summer, don't they? I think kind of
Mm.
maybe during July, like the end of June and
Yeah.
July is pretty much off work. But it didn't mention that. It suggested that Northern European countries tend to just spread their holidays more evenly. There's two things to mention about it. I think it reflects the like economic ability of the wealthier northern countries to afford more holidays and more international travel as well. So it's much more likely that the Belgians, the Irish, and I think it was the Dutch are the countries where they travel abroad more likely, whereas the French and the Greeks are the least likely to travel abroad. So it also reflects the availability of attractive like local destinations.
I was about to say,
So
I don't think that's entirely about the cash. That's just people in the Netherlands and UK being miserable with the inconsistent summer, and you need some guaranteed 25 to 30 degrees C. You know what I'm saying? So, if I was Greek, do you really want to go anywhere else other than check out an island or somewhere? I mean, come on. And France, obviously, wonderful place. I think the number one tourist destination on a country basis. More people visit France than any other country, I believe.
it is for
Um,
me.
yeah. So anyway, a wonderful post by our good friend Mariano Mamatino, who is a labor economist. I think he's at Burning Glass or something. But he took an interest basically of the variance on holiday and holiday habits of different European countries. I thought it's super interesting, not only just for curiosity's sake, but also massively relevant for recruitment. Because if you're recruiting in that territory or you've got an international sort of remit, you do have to think about, like, are people switched on to the idea of work? You might be spending a lot of your time completely at the wrong time trying to don't do an outbound campaign in Stockholm and in early late July.
Right.
Yeah, that's not going to work. um, so,
So,
so yeah, like you got to think about it. And I think you're right. I think the Spanish and the French tend to stagger their holidays. I know that's true on schooling for France, isn't it? They don't have block sort of times where everyone is on holiday. They've actually got different school terms, which I think is really smart, which means it's more consistent distribution of leisure tourism throughout the year, rather than in the UK, everyone's crushed it for the 2 weeks on half term or whatever, and that spikes the prices and it makes everyone horrible traveling backwards and forwards. Don't see why we just don't adopt what France do. It's like much more sensible.
well, we do in
Um,
Scotland. Scottish holidays don't have the same footprint as English holidays. So when we that means that yeah, the prices of going on holiday, if you're in Scotland, are not not as bad as if it was at the same time as English schools. So our summer holidays are probably about a 3, maybe even a 4 week difference, like ahead. So my kids finished school around about the 20th of June or something like that, and they went back this week.
That makes sense. It makes sense to stagger away from the majority, because what I know from sort of the holiday situation in England is that everyone goes away at the same time, which obviously makes huge competition for travel, huge competition for accommodation. All the prices go up, and it just ruins the holiday. It just makes it harder for everyone. So I think what France do is that they stagger it per region or something, so that you got 2 weeks, and then week 1 and 2 is this group of people, week 3 and 4 is this group of people, week 5 and 6 are this group of people. Just share it around. I mean, everyone, and then the holiday sort of seasonal industries obviously get more consistent revenue over time as well, so easier to hire people and not have to compete for staff for those really micro points. So it seems like an obvious thing to do, but yeah, anyway, really interesting. I think follow Mariano, by the way, a really good writer and a person who's just a great contributor to it. We need to get back on the show. Anyway, give us something else, Adam.
Okay, so the United Kingdom has got an aging population and a shrinking workforce. Certain countries in Africa, if not all countries in Africa, pretty much have got high youth unemployment and high inflation. Okay, so we don't have enough people to staff our care sector, and therefore we can offer attractive opportunities for people in countries like Nigeria and Ghana to come to the UK and work in that area. There was 22,000 people who came to the UK to work in that area in 2022 and 57,000 in 2023. There are, of course, other factors in this, such as we don't want those pesky Danish software developers and pesky Dutch data scientists anymore. So obviously I jest, but Brexit's put a stop to people coming from other closer countries. But Africa appears to be filling a gap there. There's high demand from recruitment agencies are reporting high demand for people to want to do that, with Kenya in particular being a country that was cited as being a good talent pool.
Look, it's a really interesting post, and 74.com I think is a really good resource as well. So anybody's interested essentially in a kind of non-European English language but non-European type of content, it's actually really, really accessible destination. What is very interesting is obviously the UK aging population. We need healthcare workers. We always have been importing healthcare workers, particularly in the EU period. We were very dependent on Polish nurses, for instance. A huge component of Polish healthcare professionals came here. No longer happening in terms of in any volume. So we've basically replaced those with Nigerian and Ghanaian and now you say Kenyan nurse and healthcare workers. Now and obviously this now causes all of the people who voted for Brexit to go up in arms, because in large part, Brexit would turn out to be an anti-immigration vibe, and we've seen already on the streets that anti-immigration is something that is, unfortunately mainstreaming. And yet at the same time, the reality is we do not have enough people to look after our elderly and are infirmed, and we're going to get more old. We're going to get more infirmed. So this is not going to go away. And in fact, so much so that we're exploiting these people, like bringing the nurses from Africa, is that Nigeria has actually put in a rule to stop this from happening, because they have trained these nurses and they see these nurses disappear off to the UK, and they've actually now put in a rule to say you've got to do 2 years of your after your qualifications in country before you can leave. Even though we're ambivalent as to whether it's good or bad to get this African immigration, that's going to be cut off in due course. So because these are valuable resources the host country that has produced them want to retain. So we really, at times don't know what we're after. But anyway, really good to look at this African workforce. What is the future there in terms of how we do things? Really interesting. Go check it out. Share the link in the chat stream.
One more.
Yeah, go
on. YouTube really knows me so well, and it serves me. Like everything it serves me is something I'm interested in pretty much. And so about a month ago, it served me a video from the BBC, which the headline was "The Japanese Man Who Gets Paid to Do Nothing."
Yeah.
And I would have ignored it because it looked quite boring, but it had 4.5 million views. So I clicked on it and I watched it, and it was about 10 minutes. And it was about a guy who literally gets paid. His job is to accompany people to a restaurant, to the shops, to just sit. He's not to say anything. He's not to initiate conversation. If he's spoken to, he can respond, but mostly he doesn't. He's just quiet. He's just there as a presence, right? It's not sexual. It's simply, and there was as part of the video, there was some of his clients who said, look, I've recently divorced and I kind of just like having somebody around. There was somebody else who said she'd recently moved to a new city and didn't really know anybody, right? And so I was thinking about it. I was reading all the comments and whatever, and I was thinking, gosh, do we live more solitary lives, some of us, even in cities, than we did?
Of course.
So when you included the article talking about basically paid friends, right? I thought, oh, hang on a second. This is not just in Japan, because this was all about China, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got people who are professional phone buddies, professional gaming buddies, professional shopping buddies. I actually did have another one YouTube sent me about people who get paid to cuddle, right? Not sexual, just to give somebody a cuddle occasionally. Mm-hmm. And I think Michael said, some people need to be married. Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't see any married people having like paid. I'm not sure what my wife would say, for example, if I had a paid friend, male or female, who, but anyway, we are we living increasingly solitary lifestyles? There was some issues around social stigma, maybe some concerns around safety in this, but it's just really interesting to know that this companionship economy is developing.
Yeah, and I really like the post of that, the concept companionship economy, because that's exactly a very good descriptor. Basically, if we're in a world that's going to be dominated by AI and automation, there's one thing that maybe AI cannot replace, is that just sense of human being there, and the sense of company. And yeah, maybe you would compensate people for that. People struggle to make friends. We're all very famously, as you get older, it's harder to do that. Big cities become more transient also. People come and go, friends come and go. Anyone who's lived in the big city knows that. So it's hard to build long-term relationships that stay around. So yeah, and oftentimes we're very hobbyist in urban environments. We end up doing very particular things that, maybe you'd like someone to accompany you to do that. So yeah, interesting. And I think I put it in as a future of work opportunity. And I was just thinking, are you particularly good at making friends? Or are you particularly good at just having, repartee with somebody? You could probably convert that into work at some point, I should imagine. Right. Anyway, let's get our guests on, because we're wishing on. We're going to be talking about new Labour government. This is the topic of the conversation. I've listed, I don't know whether you looked at this yourself, Adam, as an entrepreneur, someone who potentially hires people, but I've listed 6 things that the Labour government are going to make changes on, have made promises on. When they come back on from recess, they'll say this. So I'll just run through them real quick. And as the guests come on, actually, we'll get the guests on now, and then I'll run through them with them. And we're just going to talk through them one by one. So let's see who we've got. We have Neil Carberry. There he is. Excellent. Let's bring Neil on. Where is... I'm sure I saw Dave D'Souza somewhere. Oh, there's Ray. Let's bring him on. Rachel can't join us, by the way. She's joining us in spirit, so she's in the chat. She's in the chat component, and she's there with us. But I spoke to Rachel earlier today. Unfortunately, her voice is really gone. I'm not going to force her to have a conversation on screen when she's not feeling particularly well. Neil, great to see you. You're looking like you're calling from heaven. Like, yeah, the blazing whiteness there.
That's where I move now. You know,
wreck heaven.
We're still playing with the RAC studio, so the lighting's not quite right. And unfortunately, the trouble with this is I don't get to play with it in advance, so I'm just going to have to look like this. It's going to help me stand up against Adam on the basis that I went to County Mayo on holiday, so I'm still milky white.
Milky white Scots people. That's better than like ruddy roast beef Scots people. Anyway, let's do some intros. Okay, let's go Neil first. Neil, who are you? What it is you do?
Neil Carberry, I'm Chief Executive of the REC, which is the UK's professional and sector body for recruitment, talent and staffing. And I'm also, for this purpose, the employer team captain on the ACAS Council, which is the UK's advisory body on employment relations.
Yeah, fantastic. Really looking forward to seeing what you got to offer on this. Ray, great to see you. Thanks for turning up. I know you got a holiday tomorrow, but briefly, who are you? What it is you do?
Hi, everybody. Ray Walker. I am VP of Contingent Workforce Management in WorkSum. Ultimately, I look around the world making sure that the contingent workers are operating within the rules and boundaries that we set, compliance, immigration, all of those sort of bits and bobs. Been doing it for far too long, but keeps me interested at least and pays the bills.
Yeah, fantastic. It's always a moving target as well. Change of legislation, changes of government. So great to have you on with us, Ray. We have David D'Souza as well. David, it must be a long time since you've been back on the show. I'm not sure whether I can even remember last time, but wonderful to see you, sir.
No, I've missed you. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you fine. Can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Yeah, my name's David D'Souza. I'm Director of Profession at the CIPD. We're the professional body for HR and people development. So we've got quite a big policy team that have been looking at the implications of some of the proposed legislation.
Yeah, cool stuff. We've got expert panel here, folks. I've got a list. By the way, I just got this from TikTok, so it may not be accurate, but the guys here will tell me whether I'm right or wrong. First, we're going to one by one, okay? And I want your opinion on this. What is the impact and how do you think it's going to impact recruitment generally? First one, no age limit on minimum wage. So I understand it. Currently, minimum wage, you can get away with paying like a lower tier for younger people. Is that correct? That's going to go. So I understand everyone's just going to get boosted up to the minimum level to the point where, okay, you're going to be paid the same rate. Your age is not going to come into the calculation as to what you can be paid. Is that right or wrong, Neil? You kind of wave your hand on this. You're not quite sure. What's your view on this?
So I declare an interest from a member of the Low Pay Commission. There are multiple youth rates of the minimum wage. It's not entirely clear that we aren't just talking about merging the rate for 18 to 21-year-olds with the adult rate rather than the rate for 16 and 17-year-olds. I think for businesses, doesn't make a lot of difference. Lots and lots of businesses are paying adult rate right down to 18 anyway. It's typically a small business, local shop thing for people who are working a few hours a week. So I think the business impact is likely to be relatively low. You can't go out and hire for a 19-year-old. If someone's 22 and they apply, you have to treat them equally. So I think it's much more, the debate for government is really about the impact on young people leaving school, perhaps 16, 17, with no qualifications, where what you really need to do is get them into some form of workplace. So it's more of a public policy debate. I think for businesses, I wouldn't worry too much about this.
Interesting. David, you got a thought on this?
Yeah, we know lots. I'd agree with Neil. The impact may actually be limited. There are lots of employers that already would pay a more consistent rate than this anyway, so it's probably limited in terms of its impact. I think there's some really interesting things more broadly in the political sphere around the interaction with the Low Pay Commission, what it means in terms of kind of negotiations with unions and pressure on pay. But I think as an independent policy on its own, as it becomes clearer, it's likely that actually the impact for employers may be minimal for most.
do you know how many companies are paying, like on a percentage basis, how many are paying sort of at a lower rate on the youth side, or is that not visible to anybody?
There is some really good evidence that the LPC have put together, and broadly, the majority of people who are paid below the rate, the adult rate, are actually apprentices in the early stages, and thereafter it's young people doing Saturday jobs. Most firms of any size aren't using the youth rates.
Right, very good.
So hairdressing is a classic sector that does use the youth rates, for instance.
Okay.
Milk delivery, like milk rounds.
Yeah.
So I guess the people who might be impacted most are actually, let's say, young people on the Saturday job. Then they can be expected to get a boost. I assume, is that correct?
Well, or you offset it. It's a bit like today's debate in the press about raising national insurance for employers, where you go, well, employers will meet that one of two ways. Either they'll hire slightly less, or they'll pass it forward in pay to the staff. So there are offsets here. I mean, it's quite common to say that we've not seen any negative effect of the minimum wage, and I think largely that's true. But if you're a part-time woman in a coastal town in England, you are getting fewer hours now than you would have otherwise. So there are trade-offs here. And I think particularly in this environment, David and Ray will know from their own worlds, where companies are a bit more up against it after the growth pattern that we've had for the last few years. Particularly, minimum wage is largely a business-to-consumer issue. Business-to-consumer businesses tend to be labour-intensive, and they tend to have had a tough time through the pandemic and through the recession. I think it's a judgment call, to David's point, about for the LPC as to how quickly to do this, given that the last thing you want is to be exposing young people to a period of unemployment and youth.
Yeah, very interesting. Ray, you got any thoughts on this? This is a little bit outside sort of your sort of expertise, I would imagine. But yeah, any thoughts on that sort of no age limit on minimum wage?
Yeah, so from a professional level, it doesn't influence my life at all. But from a personal level, I'm in a rural community. There's a lot of people who will be paid according to the rates according to their ages. So it does have a much bigger impact. As Neil was saying, sort of on a coastal side, we're in a rural, but yeah, it does have a much wider impact here on both the employers and the employees. So it's sort of interesting that it will help the people who are on the fringes of the commercial side of things, as opposed to the main cities and towns, whatever.
Yeah, very interesting. Good stuff. Okay, so I generally feel like pretty positive with that idea. I mean, it's like, okay, people should be paid, I mean, there's an argument you could pay people less, but, in the sense that if it's 18 to 21, I don't see how that's not an adult anyway. So, you know what I mean? It's like you pretty much are. So that's good. Okay, moving on to number 2, unfair dismissal. So I think this is quite a significant one. As I understood it, prior to, in fact, as it currently stands, as no legislation has been passed, if you have a problem, so you've been dismissed, you think it's unfair, your ability to go to tribunal is based on how long you've actually been working in that organization, as I understand. But Labour are going to come in and say you've got a day one right to tribunal rather than, I believe, 2 years. So this, to me, strikes me as a particularly significant, because it means that on the one hand, obviously, employees will have more, workers will have more power to contest an unfair dismissal. But I wonder whether some organizations might then say, oh, I've got elevated risk now. Maybe I won't hire as many. David, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not quite that straightforward on unfair dismissal. So you can be, there are some things that are regarded as automatically unfair dismissals, and that kicks in from day one. So what you can't do is someone's been with you for a week and you fire them for having a protected characteristic. So for instance, you find out that they're gay, you're not protected in law then from just dismissing them from the organisation. So it's slightly more nuanced than that. But yes, what the government's proposing at the moment, it appears to, and Neil's been involved in some of these consultations, and we are as well, is the government suggesting that it would reduce it, but it would also potentially create a more structured probation program so that employers would have some protection or recourse if things don't go well in terms of performance. It's unclear at the moment what that would look like and how that would be structured. We know that we did a relatively large survey, so 2,000 employers, and we know that there were not insignificant groupings of them that were flagging up that they might hire in a different way. So they might hire more temps rather than permanent employees, that they might hire more self-employed contractors rather than permanent employers. And some of them are just saying they'd be less likely to hire because it does shift that balance of risk depending on how this is structured. Overall, pretty much about 50% of the sample just wanted things left as it was. Only 5% actually wanted these rights brought right forward to day one, because I think it's a significant change in that risk balance. But we're urging the government to consult on this. We think that there's probably something to be struck in the middle. We're around that structured probation. But what's really interesting is we've spoken to organisations that deliberately removed probation because they wanted people not to feel at risk when they started and to feel integrated. This would actually force them potentially to bring something like that back in.
Very interesting. Neil, go ahead.
Look, I think across, David's hinted at the fact that last week his colleague Peter Cheese and I and 2 or 3 other business reps met with Deputy Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Business on all this. And I think across the piece, across all the business organisations, this is the thing that's seen as a really big intervention and potentially you could get really wrong. And it is this thing is no one's yet explained to me how you have day one unfair dismissal rights and retain probation. And it's all very well to say that you can have a looser process for probation. But if I, as a small business, bring someone into my business and they aren't right in week 2 or week 3, and we know they're not right, if I have to follow the rigmarole that is the ACAS discipline and grievance code, and it's justifiably a rigmarole, I should add, as a councillor, to dismiss them. So it's taken me 3 months to dismiss someone who I've decided isn't the right person in 2 weeks. I know what my advice to hiring managers is, which is be very, very careful. And so I think there are some pieces to work out here. I think what I'd emphasize in all of these, Hung, is none of this is happening on October the 1st, 2024. And there are probably 4 kind of broad headings here of stuff the government's just going to do now because ministers have powers to do it. Stuff they'll need to legislate, primary legislation for, like getting rid of the Trade Union Act 2016. Stuff they'll need to think heavily about, like this, and then stuff that is off in the never, never. We might get to employment status later, but that's a classic example of something that's complex. So this is in this space of they're going to legislate to do something called day one unfair dismissal. What that is really up for grabs, which is a really kind of long advert for saying if you're an agency, you should be working with us, HR professionals should be working with David, because I think there is an opportunity to get this right and avoid some of those negative connotations. We've got to have a world where if you hire someone and it's patently wrong for very good, valid business reasons in the first month or 2, that you can shake hands and say, this isn't for us.
Yeah. And broadly speaking, we would anticipate that to be just the case anyway, because it's usually an uncomfortable situation if the fit isn't right. Both parties might actually come to terms and, not have to go to tribunal. So it'd be interesting to know what the percentage of dismissals actually do go to tribunal. But do you know, David? I mean...
No. So, well, the other thing that I'd highlight, and again, Neil's wearing 2 hats today, is if this happens, then potentially you have a greater percentage of people that may, over time, want to go to tribunal. That system is under incredible amounts of pressure. So you've got people wanting to go to tribunal now. The cases are getting scheduled for 2 years from now. ACAS have actually got a really critical role to play in terms of mediation pre that. So if this was to happen, there are a number of other things the government would need to do to make sure that actually where people do the wrong thing or employers do the wrong thing, there's still access to justice. Because otherwise it just becomes a piece of legislation that has no teeth, because essentially you could do the wrong thing, you could dismiss someone unfairly, but it's going to take far too much time and effort for them to ever get any recourse to that. And I think the key thing with this piece is when we're speaking to our members, they're broadly supportive actually of the intent that sits behind it. which is to reduce the amount of precarious work, to give people confidence in their employment relationships. What they're concerned about is some of the way that it's being implemented may cause actually the opposite of that to happen. So, for instance, you might be less comfortable hiring someone earlier in their career because you're concerned that it's going to be difficult if it doesn't work out, or you're going to have to invest too much in getting them up to speed and scale. So the very things that the government might be wanting to try and encourage through this, it might actually disincentivize. And that's why, as Neil says, the consultation is absolutely key.
And if you're a small employer, obviously, and someone does bring a claim, and you're facing that 18-month, 2-year wait to get to tribunal, all of your impetus is to write the check, isn't it? And what might you have spent that check on if you hadn't had to write that check? If you're a small business, maybe that's your IT investment for productivity. So there's a real sense of just what I've been pleased by is whenever we talk to government about this, they put their growth goal first. Now, if you put your growth goal first, you've got to get this right. You've got to find a way of getting the balance right, because we're really talking about businesses that cannot afford to be spending loads of time waiting 18 months for a tribunal and spending loads of money on solicitors.
Yeah, practical issue. And actually, Rachel in the chat mentioned something really interesting. There may be strengthened investment for companies on the assessment side. So you've got to get it right early on. So it's not just, you can't wave people through, because the exiting the individual is going to be harder. Let's agree that as the baseline. So it's going to be more difficult no matter what the implementation is, in which case you've got to, so I think better for assessment tech, better for recruiters, maybe there's going to be more scrutiny. And maybe on the employer side, some companies might be thinking a little bit more of more flexi labor. So Ray, I wonder whether you've had any thoughts on this, or whether any of the customers or interactions you've had with businesses that tell you that perhaps they're going to increase the non-FTE component of their workforce in order to hedge against some of this legislation.
It's going to have a massive impact in its rawest form. It will have a massive impact on the industry that I work in. There's kind of like 4.7 million contractors in the UK who ultimately could be forced down an employment route for various different reasons. And if they've got day one rights on that, how do you unravel that? So you've got a big impact on how that's sort of managed. Obviously, we go into the weeds with regards to IR35, which the way that's managed kind of pushes people more down the employment route nowadays, more than they perhaps should do. Again, if you've got that. So I agree with everything that David and Neil were saying. You've got to break away. It has to, what ends up being the legislation has to be something weaker than what the headlines are at the present time, because it's just too strong. It will strangle everything. And there's a big danger that clients who wish to then engage people will take them via a temporary supply route. And as we know as well, the supply route, the umbrella companies in the UK, there's big question marks over those. And are you just setting up bigger problems that are pushing things into the shadows? So this is definitely the point that needs to be discussed and understood and implemented in the best way that it can be, because the implications across the entire market, be that permanent or temporary, is quite sizable.
To Ray's point, actually, one of the things I hear most from REC members right now is this sense of don't pass a law and then fail to enforce it. Because if you pass a law that creates a workout and fail to enforce against that workout, and we've been really clear on the necessity of umbrella company regulation, for instance, all that happens is that the compliant lose out to the non-compliant. So there is a big link here to their whole concept of a single enforcement body as well, and how that works and getting that right.
Yeah, I echo that massively. The single enforcement body has been voiced for a number of times, and there's nothing out there. And I agree with exactly what you just said there, Neil, as well. The compliant are suffering because of the non-compliant still getting away with this. So, but that's a long conversation I can sit and have over that. But yeah, definitely a worrying area.
Was that one of your 6, by the way, the single enforcement body?
No.
Didn't make it to TikTok. It's probably worth like
make it to TikTok. I'm relying on one dude giving me all my information, mate. So the Labour
wasn't even my
TikTok
from that.
It wasn't your TikTok. You need to get on it.
I know.
So let's talk about the one enforcement body. Is that actually what the plan is for Labour to do this? Can someone explain what that is and what's the idea?
So the basic principle is that enforcement is done by different agencies. So national minimum wage is done by HMRC, you've got the Young Masters Licensing and Labour Abuse Authority, you've got the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, we don't have a classic labour inspectorate in the UK. And part of the challenge, and Margaret Beales, the Director for Labour Market Enforcement, has been really clear about this, is actually information sharing is difficult. And yet we know in the worst cases, things just layer on top of each other. Different things are happening in different spaces. The same places that are exploiting workers are often health and safety lacks. So there's an obvious case to join things up. The real risk is as you join things up, you pile a load of things that don't work well together. So if you're immigration enforcement, you naturally take quite a police-like approach. I'm really defensive of the quality of the work that Ben Bruton and the Employment Agency Standards team do. I think they're an excellent regulator that do really good and meaningful work. They're specialists in our sector, and they do that in an educate, enable, enforce approach. I don't want them kicking down the doors of agencies because they've dotted the wrong I on a contract somewhere. So getting that right is really difficult. So it's a good idea in principle, but it requires lots of work to get right.
Yeah, and I'd just build on that. Again, I think ACAS have got a really key role to play, because actually your target is to have less stuff that needs to be enforced. That's a better way of running a country. And the other thing is you'd need to match it with a really good information support program for small businesses. So quite a lot of the time when you get transgression in a smaller organization, it's a lack of awareness or a lack of structure that's causing that, rather than a desire to operate in a less optimal way. So you'd have to see both of those to take pressure off some of those systems as well. So it's a good idea, but as Neil says, it's the practicality of that. And also it's trying to do that in lockstep with the changes that you're making to ensure that it's got the capacity to deal with actually some of the outturns and the outcomes of some of the other policy pieces.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And the small business piece is highly relevant, because I think that's the largest percentage of obviously business in the UK, and I believe it employs something over 50% of the people here. So there's lots of those companies that probably haven't just skinnied up on all of this, because sometimes a small company starts off as a one-person band. They hire a few people. Before you know it, you got 10 people working for you, and suddenly, some of this legislation you didn't even think about actually then applies. So where's the support there? In fact, Adam, I mean, you're an example of this, aren't you? In a slightly different way, but operating Poetry HR right now, it's like you got like 5 people on staff or something in it, 5 people on payroll, and then there's a bunch of people on contract or something, isn't it? So you're probably encountering some of this without necessarily planning for it.
Well, actually, it's one of the things I was going to say to Ray, but I was going to wait till the end, and I think that like a company like Worksom's got a very, very bright future, because if I take my company for example, we've got 4 people in our business, but at all times we are working with other professionals who are bringing their expertise to certain moments in time where we need them to work on certain things. And I really do believe that most large companies probably already have smaller head office functions than they have had, and that's going to keep going down. So there's always going to be tasks to do, but you could see it especially in the tech sector right now. There's so many companies that are reducing their fixed headcount, but they still will need specialists, and I think that's going to become more of a norm in the way that organizations get their tasks accomplished.
I'd agree. I actually spoke to someone. I do a lot of work in the creative sector, and I spoke to a business. The individual company's got 3 permanent employees and 350 on the bench. So that whatever project they win, they can then just go and tap into those. I think that's a real insight into what the future looks like.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the younger people in the working space nowadays as well, are all quite happy that they're not designed to work this 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, working for the same employer for X amount of years. They've got this freedom of mind to go and work and do what they want, have side hustles and all of this. I think we're going to see a big shift in attitudes and in culture of how people are engaging, and that contingent space, as it's that's the easiest name to go with it, it's just going to continue to grow. The challenge you've got with that is how you control all of that, how you police all of that, because there's already examples of how that things slip through the net and don't get seen, or you might try and do some cross-border work and all sorts of different sort of ways on it. So there's lots of different challenges, but the traditional way of working, and dare we say the horrible word, but COVID definitely accelerated that. It absolutely changed things really quickly in the fact of you don't need to be in the same town anymore. You don't need to be within commutable distance. You can do this work wherever you want to be as long as you've got good Wi-Fi and a laptop. Really has changed the world dramatically. And for me, it's a somewhat of a hobby of mine almost, when working in and around these sort of like the rules and regulations. I do enjoy it. So I'm interested to see how it develops. I'm interested to see how the legislation catches up and controls it, because that's the biggest problem at the moment. It's not there. One of the things, I think Neil mentioned it slightly, and I don't know whether it's on Hung's list, but it's the single worker status that Labour has spoken about. I think that's going to be, I think it's impossible to crack, in my honest answer. But that's a big part of how they bring these things in. And that's just one facet of a very, very complicated and evolving beast.
Can I just build on that, Ray? I think that's absolutely right. So I'll make this is my observation of working with this government so far, and David and colleagues will have their own views on their connections. I don't think we are having to make a case for the economic contribution of the contingent workforce to this government in a way that I think we would have under Corbyn, or we would have under Ed Miliband when he was leader. What I think they don't get is why people choose to work in contingent ways. They're quite framed into a world where people work like civil servants. They're open-ended full-time employees. They have a career. So two things on that. One, we've got big REC campaign launching in the first week of September called Temp Work Works. Loads of stories from temporary workers talking about why contingent working in different ways works for them. And my one kind of sell for this afternoon is when you see it online, like, share, subscribe, some great workers talking about what they do and why they do it. The flip side of that is government needs to understand that world better and understand why people make the decisions they do. So health is a great example where they're really scrabbling with why healthcare staffing doesn't work. Healthcare staffing doesn't work because people are walking away from the NHS because the NHS is a terrible employer. And people want flexibility and they want to work in different ways. And therefore, there's lots of work to do on temporary healthcare staffing. So the NHS basically run out of money. But actually, you need to start with, why would someone want to work for me? Which, if we, from our private sector perspective, the work, Ray, you do, that comes naturally to us. I don't think it comes naturally in the public sector, and particularly to politicians. And that's why we've been quite keen on getting them to do more deep dive. And I think when you do deep dive and look at what people say, you might come up with a slightly different solution to this single worker status question than the one that was in the manifesto.
Yeah, can I build on that?
Go ahead, David. Yep.
Yeah, and apologies if we're not quite covering off the TikTok. I feel like under pressure to whoever that TikTok is to do their list rather than this. It's a really with
a little dance while you're doing it.
I can't like there's no. So it's a really similar thing, I think, with 0 hours contracts. So to Neil's point, if you've only ever worked in one sphere, it's difficult to think there may be advantages to that. So the government's pledge to try and bring an end to exploitative 0 hours contracts, I think we'd all like an end to exploitation. I think that's an easy one to get behind. But in fact, we've done quite a bit of work at the CIPD, and it shows really clearly that actually for a significant amount of people, that flexibility works for them and works for the employer. It's quite a good fit for the economy. So attempting to see that just as a bad thing that needs to be reduced rather than something that actually needs to be, to Neil's point, understood. Why would that work for someone? How can we make sure that we protect that flexibility for them as we go around this? Is a better approach, I think. And that's why the consultation is so important. It's because we can see what the government is trying to do. I think there are a lot of organisations close to these issues who would like to help them get to the best version of solving for those problems.
Very, very good, guys. Let's talk about the single worker status and zero-hour contract in a second. I think these are points on the list. But before we do that, let's make sure that this conversation continues after we come off air, because Brain Food Live does have to come off air, and we're going to be out of here in about 10-15 minutes. But obviously, we've got a much longer and deeper conversation to have ongoing as we go forward. So now is a very good time, folks, to connect with everyone who's on screen and also in the chat, wherever you're watching it. So grab your LinkedIn URL and stick it into the chat stream if you're watching this on Crowdcast. If you're watching this on LinkedIn, just put it into the comment thread there, and then make sure you connect with everyone who you see do the same. Obviously, I think in the half hour you've seen people like Neil, Ray, David, they're people you should be following anyway on LinkedIn. Because they're individuals that talk about a lot of these changes on a public basis, and you're going to just be educated by simply being more proximate to this type of expertise. So go ahead and do that. Okay, let's talk about. Can you summarize what this single sort of status means? Ray, you mentioned it. What are we talking about here? Encapsulate it for someone who's encountered this term for the first time.
We have 3 types of employment status in the UK, or 3 types of status of defining somebody in the way they're working, to be probably better at saying it. You have your traditional employee, your fixed term employment, you're taking your salary from your worker, you take control and direction, they tell you where you're going to be. You then have your more traditional self-employed individual. They go out and do their self-employed work, they get paid for the work that they do, but they're in control of what they're doing. The UK has this middle ground, which is known as legally as a worker status. And that's where you're working typically in a contract, working on behalf of a client, but you're doing it under sort of like a periodic basis, not full time. And you're not under their control and direction effectively, but you need to be paying tax as an employee for various different reasons. And we won't get into the complexities of that. But what it means is, from a tax perspective, you've got 3 status. But from an employment rights, you've only got 2 status, which is either you're employed or you're self-employed. So it means that you don't necessarily get, if you're a worker and you're then paying tax as an employee, you're not actually getting the employment rights you would get as an employee. You're getting the employment rights as a worker, which has lesser rights than what you would get any other way. So there's a lot of complicated parts on that. So they're looking at trying to put it down to just those 2 traditional categories of employee and of self-employed. And I've got 2 fantastic experts on here, and I'm sure they can actually pick apart some of the bits that I've said. So if it can be refined, I'm not embarrassed. Go for it and step it up.
I thought that was a model answer, Ray.
Yeah, I was really glad I wasn't asked. That was absolutely bang on. I think a really good example would be, in recent years, the case law around Uber and the status there. What is actually the relationship that they have? Are they working for Uber? Are they actually employed by Uber? Or are they self-employed people who happen to get some work from Uber? And that was a really good crystallization, actually, some of those debates and some of the law around that as to that distinction. But it's untidy for a number of reasons that Ray's described. But as Neil's described, tidying it up isn't easy either.
Yeah, I'm not. So Uber, the Uber case is a really good example, because I was at the CBI at the time it started going through, and both we and the TUC were unsurprised that they were workers. I actually think the law is a lot clearer than we like to pretend it is, just because, as an employer, you can't say this is your status and the law doesn't automatically agree with you. Doesn't mean the law is complex. The thing I'd say about this triple status is we actually have other countries coming to the UK to learn about our tripartite status, because I think it's quite handy in this world. You go back to the world that Ray described. We're going to have more people doing, in inverted commas, gigs. So things without mutuality and ongoing obligation, where you're doing stuff for a bit and you are in a worker status, and particularly lower down the pay scale, you probably want to give those people some protections. So I actually think a kind of worker status could be part of the answer to where we are now. And certainly our work, the Fabian Society has published a good report on this, which Kate Shoesmith and our team fed quite a bit into. And they started out, let's just get rid of it. And I think as you delve into it, you see the value of it more. Now, the reassuring thing I'd say here, Hung, is this is very much in that fourth pile of this is hard and will take time. So if we are going to see any employment status reform, it sure as heck isn't going to be in 2024, 5 or 6. So I think it's one of those ones where I think people should pay their subscriptions to their sector bodies and leave it to their sector bodies to sort out, because it probably won't come down the track to your business particularly soon.
Yeah, and it's one of the ones as well, you get absolutely plenty of notice. So it's not going to be, there's an announcement one day and suddenly everything changes. There will be a massive adjustment period, really significant one, if it happens. And if it happens in the format that they're currently outlining.
Yeah, and that's useful because sometimes you can over-prepare for things that are so far down the line and are subject to change as you go. You're actually wasting energy and effort on that. But good to at least have that on the landscape of things that might change. And it needs to feed into your decision-making going forward. Okay, I'm going to skip over the sick pay and holiday pay day one because I think that is probably something that's definitely going to happen. And it kind of aligns a little bit with unfair dismissal in the sense it's going to increase the rights of the employees, but it might just increase a little bit of the risk for the employer. So we might then see a little bit of a shift towards a non-FTE because suddenly you're going to have to give people more opportunity, sort of more benefits, basically. Two more I want to talk about. Right to switch off, but I want to talk about 0 hours contract first. Because I'm personally unclear as to whether Labour have said anything about 0 hours contract, and if they have, what are they saying, and what's the theory behind this? So, does anyone want to tackle this? Firstly, what is a 0 hour contract, and what do you think the Labour government wants to do about it? Neil, you got your hand up, so go.
So no one knows what a 0 hour contract is. It's not, and that's part of the challenge. And the use of 0 hours contracts exploded in the data about a decade ago once the term 0 hours contracts became popular in the media. And everyone who used to be casual said, no, I've got a 0 hours contract. So the thing to know is what Labour really wants to do is stop people working regular weeks and not having a guarantee of that regular week. And so if you want to know where their head is, the thing to read is the Low Pay Commission report on how to deal with irregular hours. When they were asked, should there be a higher minimum wage for people who don't have guaranteed hours after the Taylor Review 6-7 years ago, the Commission came back and said, no, you shouldn't do that. But what you should do is have some form of system where people can transfer when they're working a regular week to a contract that reflects that regular week. So that report is at the heart of Labour's thinking. And I have to slightly shamefully hold my hands up and say I was one of the co-authors of that report, which is, so I'm quite soft on its approach. The critical thing is what is regular, and if you're an agency worker, who is your employer? And our view would be regular means a pattern of the same week for at least 12 weeks. And if you're an agency worker, your employer is your agency. So, ideally, actually, I think this is a right for directly employed people, and agency workers shouldn't be covered because they've got the conduct regs and the AWR to protect them. But if they are included, they have to be included on the basis of the AWR 12-week qualifying period. So I'm expecting to end up somewhere where if you employ someone on the same pattern of hours for the same number of hours for 12 or 13 weeks, in week 13 or 14, they could turn around to you and say, shouldn't my contract really reflect that? And then you've got a decision to make about about how you deal with that. But that seems to be where they're leading. All of this is getting the detail right is really important. But they've been pretty clear that what they absolutely aren't doing is banning you from having 0 hours contracts or flexible contracts or casual contracts.
Yeah. So there's a few things from our point of view at the CIPD. One, there'd be a question over whether 12 weeks is the right time frame or whether it should be a bit longer, if only to focus on seasonality and kind of cope with that. Secondly, I think it's a really interesting space as to whether it's a code of practice or whether it's law in this space. Because you can do a lot with the code of practice as well. And again, to come back to where we were a single enforcement body, there's a lot of potential legislative change, and it's making sure that actually it's not ending up, as Neil described, with changes in the law but not being seen through into practice. So there's different ways of dealing with it. But you can see, I think actually through the frame of what the government's trying to do, you can see a lot of spaces where their philosophy and what they're trying to achieve, they're trying to do this through some of the legal changes. And it's very different to the previous government, I think, in some of the emphasis of that.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, let's switch to final point because we're running out of time. Right to switch off. So this is a really interesting one. My understanding of this is that the direction of travel is the government wants to tell companies that they're not allowed to communicate with this sort of give instruction or give work to workers outside of the contractual hours. So your boss basically can't call you up on a Sunday and say, "Listen, I need this document now," and that's going to be a no bueno. No, my feeling is what's going to happen is companies are just going to write in something as a waiver, aren't they, into the employment contract to say, "Yes, I am happy to receive this." But anyway, have I got my understanding right? And what do you think is going to happen? Let's go round robin on this. David, you go.
Yeah, so look, it might be a code of practice again on this space. It's happy to share that I had to stop one of my colleagues communicating with me earlier in the week about a media opportunity right to disconnect because they're on holiday. So we had this strange situation. They're like, "We've got an interview connect." I was like, "Just stop messaging me. You're supposed to be taking a break." It's probably a code of practice. I think there's some really difficult bits when you get down to actually putting this into practice around how you monitor it in shift work, what technology you'd use to bar or reduce that contract. It's good workplace practice just to set reasonable boundaries and have agreements with people. But actually the legislation around this might be tricky. So we think code might be a good place for it to be.
Thoughts on this, Ray?
I think it's going to take a mighty cultural shift within our country for it to be adopted, because you can have whatever you want, but ultimately people are worried about what their employer might think of them. Are they going to not read their emails or respond to something and report them, whether rightly or wrongly? I think that, you know, there's a big cultural situation in the UK where professional services workers will sit on the beach looking at their phones, checking their emails, checking their Slack messages. Is that going to change because of a new piece of either code of practice or legislation? No, I don't think it will.
Yeah, and we recruiters here are worse for that, right? I mean, we're the only idiots on the planet that has LinkedIn downloaded on the mobile phone. You know, who else? Normal people don't do that. So, you know,
it's on my first page as well. Yeah, my LinkedIn's on my first page. So yeah,
absolutely. All right, Neil, your view on this?
Look, guys have already said this is not going to be a law, and to the extent that there is going to be a law, there probably already is a law. I think that, you know, a pattern of an employer repeatedly phoning you on the weekend and putting pressure on you sounds like bad practice that might be claimable on one basis or another already under the law. It's a really interesting thing. We have gone maybe 10 years without government trying to steward the culture, to Ray's point, of the labour market at all. I think this government is ready to try and do that through the industrial strategy. I think this falls under that how do we organise work discussion. And to Rachel's point in the chat, how do we understand that what out of hours is varies very differently for people? You know, in a week or two's time, I will send a note to the REC staff saying, I'm going to start sending you emails at 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock on a Sunday night. Ignore them. That's just when I choose to work. Why do I choose to work that way between September and February? Because the Green Bay Packers need to be watched. And so there is something here about that balance between, it's that good employment relations that's at the heart of this, and the conversation between employers and employees. I think the government wants to drive that, but the right place to drive lots of this is actually through the industrial strategy, through how we reform management education, around the good practice that David and his colleagues set out in HR. There's a whole piece here of stewardship, which is not about the law. And go Pack Go, as Joe said.
Yeah, fantastic stuff, folks. What a very interesting sort of session. These are fascinating for me because I find myself a little bit lost in the weeds when it comes to the the legislation. I struggle to read these things. So having a dialogue and discussion with people that have gone beyond that is really, really useful. So we have to sort of finish it there. This is an ongoing concern. So obviously we'll keep monitoring this as we go. We may look at, 6 months down the line, doing a redo on this. But let's take the moment and thank our wonderful panel for joining. So thank you, Neil Carberry. Thank you, Ray Walker. And thank you, Dave D'Souza, for joining us and sharing your intel with us. Have a good weekend, guys.
And you guys.
Take care.
Very, very interesting. Folks, listen, I hope you found that interesting. It's one of these things I think I'm going to replay and listen back on because it's very educational. I personally have confidence that this government is going to be very mature with this. And I have the general sense that the British people as a culture will probably get to grips with this in a sensible way. There's a common sense, there's a stereotype of the Brits having some degree of common sense, rather than just lean into the letter of the law, so to say. And I do believe that we're going to end up in a decent place, probably a better place for workers, but not in a horrible place for employers. Okay, that's about it. We have to leave it off. Remember, you are working tomorrow because this is Thursday, not Friday. So premature weekend celebrations. We are going to be back next week. We've got 2 things to think about. We've got Founders Focus with Rune Reistrup, CEO of Juno. So make sure you join us for that. That's on Wednesday. Wonderful to learn about leadership lessons from Rune. And we're back on, I think, the 30th with a really important show about maternity returners. We know about maternity leavers, folks, but do we have a policy on maternity return? Are we expecting people to simply drop back in as if nothing happened? Because lots of things have happened, both for the returnee and also in the organization that would have developed and evolved in the 9 months or year or so that person's been away. We've got a wonderful load of panelists come to join us with this. A reason why I wanted to do this show, by the way, is because I had a conversation with a recent a friend of mine that had returned to work as having left mat leave, and she felt like completely unsupported, like no clue what to do, and needed to be re-onboarded on it. So really interesting to do that. Make sure you sign up for that. Follow the channel if you're interested in any kind of updates, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Listen, I just want to say one quick thing, right, about that. I didn't vote in the general. Well, I did actually. I spoiled my vote in the general election.
Yeah, you did a democratic process, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I don't want to. I'm going to try and avoid making a political comment here, but this Labour government really can't. You said you've got confidence in them. I've got confidence that there's no way that they can be less toxic and corrupt and incompetent than the last one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're at a low bar. I mean, my politics is pretty anti-conservative. I mean, I'll be very honest with that. Even though I do think there's some, I've got some conservative views for sure. But certainly the post-Brexit period in government, I think the Conservatives have just been consumed with internal infighting. We've had 5 different PMs and just been knifing each other in the back. And I was thinking, who the F is doing the governance?
Utter embarrassment.
Exactly. Who's running the country? It's ridiculous.
Who the heck? So, where was the probity that should have existed, that should have prevented, like, several of these prime ministers, with the obvious one being, I've tried to block her name out my head, but Liz Truss. How did Liz Truss get anywhere near the leadership of any organization?
To be honest with you, I don't think the way in which we produce politicians is a good way of selecting for leadership anyway. But even less so when you're looking at a tribal grouping, which most political parties are very tribal, and they're also in politics. If you sign yourself up to be a political party member, which by the way is like less than 5% of the UK population, I think most normal people are not members of political parties. We will go and exercise a vote. But if you are a member of a political party, chances are you're already a little bit more ideologically extreme than the average person. So what happens is you end up voting for your ideological hero, and you'll end up with extremist politicians, or politicians that don't have basic level of competence. They say the odd zinger on question time, and it gets you excited, and suddenly that makes them qualified to be a prime minister. Nonsense.
When Neil was talking about the NHS earlier, I posted in the comments that I think we need to do a lot more product management around employers and careers and specific jobs. And actually, Bill Boorman's talked about this quite a lot, like moving away from employer brand and towards the concept of like job brand, the brand of this particular job. And we definitely need to do more product management about it. When we think about the employer value proposition, what's the package we put together? What's that package we put together, and what's appealing to certain types of people? You know what I would do immediately to make Britain a better place is I'd make the salary for a member of parliament 200,000.
You and I disagree with this.
You do that, you get like 50 times more people wanting to be a member of parliament. I assumed you were joking when you said pay them nothing and put them in a hole and make them vote and all that stuff. Yeah. That's got to be. I assume that's not a joke.
That's not a joke. I think being a politician should be a monastic vocation. You should take a lifetime vow of poverty. You should literally wear a hair shirt. You should be in a monastery. I'll do it.
I'll tell you who's going to do that. Rich Etonians.
No.
Who don't have to work because they own half of Shropshire.
They have to disavow all of this stuff. So you provide a stipend. You be provided with a lifetime voucher. You can go eat at any restaurant, that kind of thing. You'll be sorted out. But what you can't do is accumulate wealth.
Well, we're all far too materialistic for that. You're gonna cut out ambitious people from wanting to be in that, because we're all
You don't want ambition. You want good decision making. The problem with ambitious people is that they end up being ambitious for themselves.
You're going to get university lecturers, right? You're going to get academics saying yes to that, who have never actually done anything.
I would personally say. You could even draw them as lottery. I'd have the alternative to my monastic vision would be to have people selected by random and just have them vote on random stuff and just rotate them out.
Mandatory participation. So what? They have to immediately hand over all their assets to the state.
No, I don't mean that, because it's only temporary, right? So in other words, let's say. We do a random selection of any individual. You're a citizen of the country. You should have a say in how the country's run. Get 100 of those, or call it 99, to get some sort of majority vote. Just rotate them in and out. You're like, all right, you got.
It's a solution, but honestly, make it a 200 grand salary, and you're going to get vastly more people wanting to go and pursue that job, and they're going to bring genuine skills out of, like, to be frank, the private sector.
I get what you're saying, and I would say the vast majority of people would agree with you, because obviously my view is kind of ridiculous. However, I don't think your view is better. I really don't. I believe that our problem now is that politics is used as into too much of a degree as an enrichment process, a networking process, and they know that, I'll be a politician, and then suddenly that's going to elevate my social status, and I'll convert that into whatever board seats, I've got whatever business deals, book deals, whatever. It's like, that is not what you want. That's the wrong incentive for people who should be making decisions for the good of the country.
Which is why if you pay them 200 grand instead of 92,000, 92,000 might be a decent salary in Dumfries. It's not a decent salary in Westminster.
I tell you what, I'd also relocate Parliament to Dumfries, because part of the problem is them having it large in London. Surely they should be in a monastery. Get them out there.
Champagne and cocaine in the old bar in the Westminster.
That's it. Anyway, listen, I'm gonna have to get off air because this is turning into something I probably don't want to record. Anyway, you have a good week, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye. Okay, mate. Cheers. Bye.